Hey everyone, my name is Felix and I work at Mimimi Games in Munich. We have just released Desperados III and today we'll be talking about designing a level the Mimimi way. First, I'll be talking about how to block a level. Then Dorian is going to talk about the level art. Then Matt is going to talk about enemy setups, and lastly Hambo is going to talk about level story. First, something about me. I'm Felix, I'm 28 years old. I'm a level designer at Mimimi Games and I've worked on level layouts, blocking and enemy setups. Desperados III is a story-driven real-time tactics game with a heavy focus on stealth, set in the Wild West with 5 unique characters in huge and open levels. To give you a better idea of what the game is about, I'm going to play a small segment of the game for you. Here we have a small storage backyard, which the player has to traverse. He goes in from the gate and has to reach a small hut. For this, I enter the gate and immediately I come upon an enemy. You can see his line of vision with what we call a view cone. This is the bright green thing you can see here. The striped area, the enemy will only see when I'm standing. In the green area, I will always be detected. So I have a problem here. I cannot reach this guard without him detecting me. For this, I have placed a sniper character on the roof earlier, where I'm going to shoot the guy and hide the body. A bit later, I'm going to topple a few crates and kill 2 more guards, which no one will notice because it will look like an accident. And for my final move, I'm going to connect 2 guards and plan ahead for some gunshots, which I then execute and kill them. This is pretty much how I cleared the entire level, which is New Orleans. This is the level we'll be talking about today. In this level, the player has to investigate for a missing friend. Here they gather clues and then regroup once they have enough evidence to where it might lead. Then they cross some backyards and go to the storage yard we just seen. But let's take it back a step. How do you actually start to build such a level? First, we define what a level actually means in the context of our game. Then we find references from real-life media and some films, movies, or games. Then we make a concept of the level layout, and lastly we define what the mission goals and actual flow through the level will be. And then we block it. The basics of the level in Desperados III is usually 1 or 2 sub-goals and an end goal, which is usually something large for the story or a big explosion. The one level takes around 1 to 3 hours, depending on the player and the actual level. We have a huge emphasis on replayability, which means you can take multiple paths and there's always a different approach to each setup. So in our first step, we look at the concept arts. These are some actual concepts we looked at for different references on different levels. And then we block it out in a rough concept, if the level actually makes sense, if it works within our engine, which is Unity, and then we decide on which one to make. In this case, New Orleans. Then we gather mood boards. You can see one for a night and one for a rainy day, which both made it into the game. And on the right, you can see a rough concept from our artist, Champ, who already defined important places for the level. For example, a saloon, the backyards, and a paddle steamer at the end. So we have a large level with different districts the player can go through. We have a neutral zone for the investigation, where they gather clues. Oh, sorry, I stumbled here. And we have the gameplay at the backyard. And we have a unique final area for a high point. So how does the mission actually play? You start with the investigation and eavesdrop for clues. Then you regroup and you go through the backyards into the final area, which looked something like this in Unity then. Here you can see most of the things actually defined by the concept artist made it into the game. You can see a saloon here, which we moved up, and the shop at the bottom left. And on the right, we have the districts the player will have to go through and the market in the center. After some iteration, it looked like this. We have still the market in the middle, but we moved the saloon and the shop. And we moved the start further up. For the end point of the mission, the steamboat, which looked like this, which we felt which was too much work for us. It used to be indoors and way too complex, so we cut it. So in the second iteration is a very important point for every step of the game, even in the early stages. So for the second part, we removed the points where the player only would go, click on, and then regroup. So we wanted to make this more engaging. What we did is we introduced 3 randomly chosen objectives. Only one of them is right, and the player will only find it out if they gather the right clues for them. And after that, they go through the backyard and into the final area. But we cut the final area, so we exchanged that for the warehouse you saw during the gameplay. So this is what it looks in the engine. Here's the investigation area, which is the marketplace, the 3 random objectives, where only one of them will be right, and the 2 backyards, and the final area at the end, which is the warehouse, the storage area. It used to be indoors, we also changed that to be open. So what are the biggest challenges when blocking? Especially for this city, it was the broad streets, the huge map space, and camera occlusion, because of the large houses and how wide and big they are. And the backyards themselves also gave us a lot of challenge when blocking. So first, let's look into the streets. The streets are only flat space. They have a few objects and only limited entries. Matt is going to talk about this later in more detail, so I'm going to move on. You can only place guards in the flat space and some balconies, and that's it, pretty much. The second thing is the map space with the houses and such. You have a lot of area that is covered with rooftops. Rooftops, we decided early on, should not be the main area of traversal. We wanted to give the player a more engaging sense with the actual city, and we aren't ninjas after all. Then we have the streets, which actually do have gameplay in them, but it's hard, as I just said. So this leaves us only with this much area for actual engaging gameplay setups. The other problem that comes on top of that is camera occlusion. Imagine a house, and imagine a guy named Dan next to it. Our camera is tilted in a way that Dan usually won't be seen if the house is placed right in front of the camera. And this is only a 2 meters high house. This is what the problem looks in-game. You have the house, and all this area is hidden from the player's view in standard camera perspective. The player would have to rotate the camera, which we usually don't endorse. And Dan would be right here, and he would be invisible to the player. So the solution is to build the districts in a horseshoe shape, which means we have the big parts of the district in the back and some smaller elements in the front. And we gain this much area from that. And there's even Dan. So this is another example for the horseshoe element. We have small houses in the front, which are only 3 meters high. These can also be fences and such. We have 6 meters high houses in the middle to break up the environment, and we have the highest and biggest houses at the back, which usually cover the streets and such. Let's talk more about the iteration. So you can see the earliest draft with the saloon at the top and the marketplace in the middle. The saloon at the top got scratched, as I just said, and we replaced that with another backyard. We added this big open garden area. It looks nice, you can see almost everything, but the problem is it doesn't really feel like a backyard. So we had to negotiate how we could fit another house into that and retain enough space to actually make gameplay work. And this is how we made pretty much everything in the level. And how this got beautiful is Dorian's work, and he's going to tell us more about this now.
Hi everyone, I'm Dorian, 27. I'm the environment artist at Mimimi. During Desperados III, I was responsible for the terrain creation and the level dressing mainly. This is me in the game, by the way. Maybe if you played it, you found me already. And I'm going to talk to you about how we get from this stage, which is basically the end stage of the blocking phase that Felix just talked about, to this. Beautiful, isn't it? But first of all, let me talk about what's the point. We already established that readability and clarity of the level layout are very integral parts of real-time tactic games and also our game Desperados III. So why go in and add stuff that possibly makes it more crowded, more stuffed, so the player might lose the center of attention? Well, it has different reasons really. One of them is the orientation. As artists, as environment artists, I try to give a sense of space to the players. We achieve this by placing landmarks that the players can remember. We also provide something like player guidance through different means. Let me show you through an example. For example, we have this backyard area, which is rather bland. All the terrain more or less bleeds into each other. There are no clear distinctions, and it looks a bit bland just. The houses are obviously still gray boxes, so no real character here. So I went in. This is how it looks in the final game. What did I do here? I first of all placed some distinguishable shapes that help the player, or rather the eye, to distinguish different areas. We have this pointy roof to the right and the polygon-shaped one to the left. They really break up the level structure a bit in this screen. And then also I tried to distinguish the different areas better. To the top we have like a backyard feel to this area, like some grass, some patchy grass, dirt, puddles. And then to the lower right we have some storage yards. And in the middle we have the street running through. So you can really tell them apart. Another example is the Brothel Area. This is how it looked during the early development stage. This is how it looks now. So what we did here in terms to enable the player to tell where they are exactly in the level is on one hand give some guidance within this screen, like paint this path on the ground that really shows where the player could walk, and also shows some hidden door that's down to the left that you otherwise wouldn't see in this camera angle. And then on the other hand, we also placed, we have this pointy roof to the right and the polygon-shaped one to the left. They really break up the level structure a bit in this screen. And then also placed, we also placed some distinguishable shapes that help the player, or rather the eye, to distinguish different areas. We also provide something like player guidance through different means. landmarks that you will see and that you will remember. For example, the lit sign to the upper right. Text always draws our attention. Then in the center we have the centerpiece, the fountain that was already there in alpha stage, but now it has animated water, and movement also helps to focus on something. And then the color red, that's more to the left, also draws the eye. So another point is the coherence. We want to give the level a feeling of being real. We want to introduce physical logic and functionality. We want to give the player the feeling that the level continues beyond the level bounds in the game. And we want, of course, to sustain a feeling of liveliness to the whole place. Just another example here. We have this cafe area. Right now in the early stage it doesn't look like much. There's not much here, obviously. This is how it looks in the final game. So what did I do here? I basically themed the whole area to look more like a cafe. You have the terrace, you have the desks, the tables where patrons can sit and eat. We have some cutlery, really small details too, that helped giving a sense of space in this area. Another point is you might have noticed the tram tracks running down here. And just to give them a sense of continuity, I added some stops and some trees in between, just to give the feeling that they go somewhere and they actually are operated. Another example is the harbor storage area. This is how it looked in the early development again. A lot of copy-paste assets placed here and everything on a pretty ugly mud texture. And this is how it looked in the end, a lot better. So again, what did we do here? First of all, I introduced some logic. You wouldn't just place cargo on the muddy ground. You would place some planks beneath it to keep it from the moisture from beneath. So that's what I did here in the first place, and also added some means of transportation to enhance the sense of functionality. People actually work there, people get this cargo somewhere. There's a crane to lift heavy stuff, there's a ship to ship stuff, stuff like that. And the last and most obvious point is we want to add visual appeal to the level. Of course, that shouldn't come at a cost to the readability, but it's still important to us to deliver a beautiful game that you look at and that's pleasant to the eye and that you can find a lot of small stories. This includes, of course, placing pretty assets, some environmental storytelling and micro-narratives that really add some depth to the whole scenery. For example, the warehouse that we already saw earlier, this is how it looked in the early stage, and this is how it looks now. Let me just point out two small things here. For example, to the upper left, we have like a gap in the roof balustrade, and the story behind that is just, it looks like it's getting fixed or something, and it actually was required through level design because you had to be able to jump down there. So that's a nice example for how we work together and find compromises where we have to. And to the right, there's just a pile of maybe stolen art goods. That's for the player to figure out, really. Another example is this backyard that later became the butcher's backyard. You can already tell there's some theming going on here. The pigs hanging down there are sign that the butcher is at work, obviously. We also have a small dinner for one up in the upper corner, and to the left we have a roof getting fixed. This was again required by level design because there's a ladder going up there and you had to be able to go through there. It's all these small stories being told just by looking at the level. Sometimes we also have to go in and rework certain areas because there are problems, whether it's gameplay-wise or it doesn't look pleasing to the eye. So what we usually do then is make a quick paint over and see what we have to rearrange and what we have to place in order to make it fit our vision more. This is how it looks in the end. We usually have several hundreds of smaller assets in all of our levels, and this is no exception. But while placing this and increasing the fidelity and the visual appeal of the level, you can't forget that readability and playability are still of utmost importance to the game. So there are certain dangers that have to be avoided when doing the environment art for a game like this. So first of all, let me take you on a quick technical excursion for that. Two things you have to know about. In Unity we have the navigation mesh that is basically used for players and enemies to walk on, to run on. And we have the view cones that Felix already mentioned. And each of our assets has two components, well, rather three components. Obviously the visual assets, then they have nav mesh occluders, which block the nav mesh that I just introduced, and the view cone occluder, which blocks the view of enemies. Okay, so what can go wrong if you place something that blocks the navigation mesh? This is how you do it, by the way. You place the asset, you bake down the mesh, and then it looks like this. You see where assets had been placed. Now the mesh is gone and you can't walk there. So obviously blocking navigation in a place where it isn't desired by level design is a bad thing. So if I just would go in here and place a wagon right in the gate, that's a no-no. Also, just removing something, opening up spaces that aren't designed to be opened up, another no-no. Then the second part is changes to the view cone occlusion. We have more or less two kinds of view cone occluders, the high ones and the low ones. The high ones block the vision completely, so you can't even stand up behind it, you will never be seen. The lower ones block them partially, so if you are crouched, you're fine. If you stand up, you'll get seen. So one risk here is obviously changing the height of an occluder, because usually it has an impact whether the cover is high or low. So for example, if I place a coach here that makes the low cover a high cover, I can't do that. Also changing the area of occlusion by placing assets to replace this placeholder. The purple blocks, the purple view cone occluders are obviously placeholders that usually get removed after decoration assets have been placed. But if you're not careful and if you don't keep the constraints, you'll end up with something like this, and you can already see that the view cone is fragmented there, and that has to be avoided at all costs. Yeah, and why this has to be avoided at all costs and why this has such an impact on the game, Matt is going to talk about in his section about enemy setups now.
Hi everyone, I'm Mathias. I'm 31 years old. I'm also a level since in scripting, and I worked on enemy setups. And in order to do that, definition of a setup here at Mimimi, and while I explain building blocks of a setup. Level for setups, but I worked on a similar level. Lean stocks is that we start differently. Our start point moves from there. Our mission objectives are rather simple, and they have to confront the bad guy of the game, Frank. It looks like this. Players go from here to the market area, which is an important item for Kate, and then they have the choice to go. So to make it a bit challenging, that's where I come in. Now, a chunk of those enemies, that's what we... For a setup is basically a toolbox with the available characters he has. Each other. Otherwise, if they wouldn't look at each other, it wouldn't be a challenge. It contains one main setup, and the setup fits in one screen. Would be one. And a setup also has an art set piece or an objective where we have to get to. Sometimes we have user. So in New Orleans Docks we have these different areas. Then our two different paths. A flatboat path for Kate. The disguise is a very important item because it makes... Now that's why I'm going to talk about the left street problematic space to design a setup in. Tell you about our building blocks. First of all, always predefined in a level, and they are like the bread and butter. In this case, it's Cooper, Kate, and Hector. Then we have, they differentiate each other from how you're distracted, but on some it doesn't work. We have to keep the camera in mind, and the entry points into a setup. It's very important that players always can make up a strategy or a plan. Really important in our game. So there. Although the goal is really we have Kate, because when Kate has the disguise, she just can simply walk. A bottleneck character kind of are Cooper and Hector. This is what we might call the problem guard. Others are watching as well. Is a static type, or in the game it's called poncho. Can't really be distracted. I mean, they can, but they don't to other enemies. So now this problem guard wouldn't be why we place key guards. In this case, it's an elite. Elite are very beefy. So Hector is the only one who can take. Now this elite also kind of acts as a timer in this specific setup for a few seconds, then walks back, talks to another guard, and that's also has to be taken care. Has to be taken for Kate basically because he's the only guard type that can see her. He also is timed because you always have to play around him with Kate. And we put other guards in there. Ideally, like this. So now we have the setup. We have the standard cam rule, what we call it. It's really simple kind of because like we have those setup parameters or like entities for like enemies, cover, and entry points. And if you were to rotate the camera, they could be covered, just like Felix mentioned, which was a big problem in the New Orleans level. Which also basically means this whole space here is not design space for me. Because our rule of thumb is we never want to force the player to turn the camera, which doesn't leave so much space left. During alpha to beta, this was basically the case for the whole level. The standard cam was turned around 90 degrees almost, and you can imagine that we had to rework lots of setups because of that. Now, for entry points, verticality, and cover. We just have this space left now as a design space. Now, verticality is really important in our game, and verticality means guards that look up there only have a lined view cone. A lined view cone means you can never be seen if you are crouched. So it enables the player to get around in a setup and to reposition themselves. It wasn't that, like, here we just had the possibility space with the balcony because we couldn't use the other balcony that I showed earlier in the camera when we rotate it. We don't require players to find that. It can be used, but it's not designed around. But we have Kate with the disguise, so it's fine as long as the elite doesn't watch. So she can move freely here. So it wasn't that big of a deal that the design space was tight in this case. But it still brought some issues. Now our bottlenecks, Cooper and Hector, they're down here, and an optimal path would like this. We have this guard at the lantern watching here. We have the entry points here, and we have cover here. And cover placement and entry point placement also wasn't that easy here, because it's all to the left, as you can see. And usually we have these kind of bushes, which are the perfect spot, because like they allow players to just get in there and then watch the situation, plan out a strategy. But in this case, bushes didn't really fit. We have a case where we use haystacks, for example, like this, but we couldn't use it in this specific area, and because it was already used, and we didn't just copy paste it. And also, it would have made full cover here. So we would have had to place it in the middle of the area, because otherwise it didn't make sense. And so in this case, we couldn't even use hiding bushes perfectly. And also note that the distance from where you have to get to and the cover, because the closer we put cover always, there were like iterations where we put it closer, the more players could always just slip through the setup, which could easily be done when the cover was too close. Now for an optimal path, a playthrough can look like this. Cooper and Hector are down there. They're going inside the door, come out in the other end, and are behind the wagon hiding. Kate is moving freely. Then there's this balcony guard. Cooper can use his coin, turn the guard, and sneak past. Now he's positioned on the balcony, crouching. Now there's this guard watching the other guard, and we can't just take him out. So Kate comes in, talks to him, turns his view cone, and distracts him. Now Cooper can strike as long as the elite is up there not watching. Then we reposition Cooper again on the balcony, moving to the next guard. Now Kate has to move away because the elite is coming back. We wait for him to talk to this guard and reposition ourselves. Then we blind this guard, because when Kate is disguised, she can't talk to a female guard because they will be bored by her. So we have to use her blind powder. Blind the guard, take out the other guard. Now Hector is positioned behind the wagon, and we have this guard left. We use Hector's whistle ability, and we have to use Hector's whistle ability and have to wait for the elite to get away again. Kate moved out of his beacon range, and we whistle the guard to us behind the wagon. Both guards get alarmed, but the static doesn't leave his post, only the simple guard. And we take him out. Now there's only 3 left, and what we do, we wait again till the elite comes back. We hit the showdown mode, which pauses the game. We can queue an action for each character. We plan an action with the revolver for Kate, an axe takedown on the elite with Hector, and a knife throw with Cooper from the balcony. And we take them out. And we can easily pass. This is like an optimal path. Usually players play it way differently, and you can do different things, whatever you like. In this specific example, it's not ideal, I would say. And speedrunners still slip the setup. He basically uses the entry points as I described them. And then he uses both distractions at the same time, which is really skillful. He sneaks with all of the players up there on the balcony, and then he sneaks past the guard, which is really tricky to do because like it's really precise. You have to do it precisely. Then he distracts the guard, and the static guard, and it just is just enough to take out the other guard, and then you just slip by. So there you have it. Our design was broken, kind of. So But it's no problem for us because this can be done only if you know the setup very well, which means you have to play it at least one time. And also it's fine because the player feels smart when he does that. And it's not easily seeable for players in their first playthrough. So up next is Hambo, and he's going to tell you something about writing. Thank you very much.
Hey there, I'm Martin, also known as Hambo. I'm 35 and I am a writer, game and level designer at Mimimi Games. And during the development of Desperados 3 I was involved in a bunch of things, but due to the expanding scope of the project I focused mainly on story and script in the end. So, we already heard about blocking and level decoration and setups. So finally I'm going to talk about how to fill a level like this with words. Short disclaimer, this is not going to be about how we set up the story or how we deliver the plot. It's not very complicated plot in our games, happens mostly in cutscenes. I'm gonna talk briefly about why in a second. And this will be mostly about dialogue during gameplay and the intentions we have with that. We actually have a list of priorities, so let's get right into it. For dialogue during gameplay, And these are very simple. The first one is always that we have to set up and support gameplay. Very basic. You have a guard that has a key, and your objective is to get that. You want to emphasize that as much as possible, and once players get the key, you say, good job, now here's your next objective. Very simple. Once we have that done, we go right into characterization and growing the world. What that means is we have these really big, open, beautiful levels. So we want characters to talk about that. Maybe you have a character who is from that location where the mission takes place, and she can tell you about the location while you explore it, and the other characters banter in between. And you get characterization that way. Now the third and lowest priority, as I already said, is delivering plot. The reason why it's the lowest priority and why we use it as rarely as possible is that you can have the best, most revelatory line you've ever written, and it does not matter when players are over there doing cool gameplay stuff, murdering and killing enemy guards and so on. So it's not very reliable, and we try to avoid it as much as possible. So we rely on cutscenes. Okay, that is our priorities down. What we also have for each level is a certain fantasy we want to sell. Maybe you are undercover at a sawmill and there's a bridge nearby you have to blow up, or you are at a ranch and you have to defend that ranch against enemy attackers. For the New Orleans level, we knew very early on that we wanted this to be a detective story fantasy. What that means is that we have a missing person, and you have a city full of suspects, and you basically have to interrogate them, gather clues, and so on. So that is the fantasy. And with that, we go into the level. Now, like Felix already mentioned, is that this level is split into two parts. We have the investigation part, which is very open and not linear, and that will be the focus of what I'm going to talk about now. And the second part, where you have a lead and you follow it, is a series of linear paths. We never have one strict linear path. We always want options during gameplay. But we have things that are less open than the investigation part. So if I take a look at this linear path part, basically because it's the easier of the two examples, is when you write for this, you know there's start and a goal, and these are all the paths the player can take. And it's very easy to identify bottlenecks, areas where there is less enemy presence. Maybe you have just completed a very difficult setup, and that is basically the perfect time to have a bit of dialogue. And with a linear progression like this, I can have one or two dialogue arcs, like involving 2 or 3 conversations, that can all conclude before I get close to the goal, where I have to emphasize gameplay again. So that is the easy case. Now on to the more interesting hard case, which is the investigation. I'm gonna block that off here. And the problem we had here, and this is very unusual even for our open levels, is that we had a start and we had a lot of paths the player could go, and that is basically all we knew. Not even the player had a very clear objective, which is very unusual, like I said. We did not know which areas the player would go to. We did not know if they would go to certain areas at all. And we didn't know the order in which they would explore the level. So how did we figure out dialogue for this? We basically went with our priorities, which was gameplay first. And just to reiterate a bit, in this case, this was the investigation. Like Felix already mentioned, there are 3 targets. One of them has a letter, you do not know which one. It will be randomized each playthrough. And you need that letter to progress. And the problem is, of course, that they are in very heavily guarded hostile zones. The rest of the level can be explored freely. So what do you do if you don't want to kill all 3 and eventually you're going to find the letter, which is also an option? Well, the idea was that we tell you, hey, there is this market area which you can explore freely. And there are a bunch of conversations that have clues, basically, on who your suspect is the right one. And some of them are also in hostile areas, but these are much easier to complete than the ones where the targets are. And the idea is that you spread out with your characters, listen in on those conversations, and if you have enough information, you can put 2 and 2 together and figure out the right target. If you want to see how that looks in scripting diagrams, like this one, we use them all the time for implementation of dialogue. And that's basically one set of clues. Like each colored node here is like 2 to 4 lines of dialogue. And so we have the purple ones, which are the conversations the NPCs have, which include the clues. Then once you have finished that, we have the red ones where the player characters re-emphasize what they've heard. Oh, they were talking about this guy or this location or this code name. And then we have a bit of wrap-up to do, and that is basically one set. And the whole investigation, if you're interested, looks like this. This is not the final setup, I don't think, but it is about the amount of dialogue we had to do for the clues, to give you an idea. So yeah, with that implemented, we basically have the investigation and we have our gameplay backbone done. And now we go right into characterization and growing the world. And we start right here. This was a cool opportunity because, like I already mentioned, this level has 2 ways to complete it. One, you do the investigation and figure out your target, or you kill all 3, and eventually you're going to find the letter. Maybe you're lucky and it's going to be the second one. You get the idea. So we said, hey, we don't want to tell the player how to complete this level. Why don't we have each character have a viewpoint which how do you say, which way of completing the level is better? So we had one character who proposes, who explains the whole situation. Then we have one character who supports the idea of gathering clues. And we have one character who says, nah, that's way too much work, let's just kill everyone. And that is always very cool when you can do that, when you can like combine setting up gameplay with actual characterization. We try to do that as much as possible. So what else did we do? Well, we knew, we didn't know the order the player would progress through the areas, but we knew that we had areas, and he would have, the players had to go through to some of them. And so we said, hey, if you enter an area, we can also play a bit of dialogue. Like, we have one character who is from this place, and if it's an area with gameplay significance, you can say, oh, this is the cafe, this is where target A is. We can do that and give a bit of flavor text about the cafe. What we also can do is say you have like a small area like this opium den, where players don't have to go, but there is a very valuable item up there, that skies for Kate, that Matt already mentioned. And so it is very likely that players will go in there. So why not have a bit of an exchange here? Like, what if Kate went up, when she comes close to this area, she says, hey, what's this, an opium den? She's never seen that before. And Isabel has seen it before and suggests that she heads in. And once she does, she comes out on the other end coughing, and Isabel is very amused. And that is basically it. Like I said, keep it simple. It's not Shakespeare, but if you do it long enough, often enough, players will get to know your characters. And that's why we do it as much as possible. Okay, so a third way that we did for this level, which was rather unusual, but the whole level is unusual, was we knew that we couldn't track physical progress through the level. But what we knew was that we could track mission progress like if you completed the mission objective. So what we did, we said, hey, these are the paths the player can take, and we set up tripwires for just a bit of banter during while characters move from one location to another. And these tripwires are set up that way because if you have completed an objective in one area, like you've investigated a target, you have to move through one of those tripwires to get to another objective. And then you again can just have a bit of casual banter. Again, if you're interested how this looks, very simple. You basically have these tripwires are inactive. Then as soon as one of these dialogues play, which is all the dialogues for, hey, we've just done a mission objective or part of the mission objective, we activate those tripwires. And then once players walk through those tripwires, we say, hey, okay, select the next line or the next dialogue in a sequence of dialogues, and then set the tripwires to a cooldown of 1 minute, because we don't want them to play all at once. And that's it. So yeah, that is everything we did for this level. In total, it looks like this. This looks very overwhelming and very dense, like people are gonna talk all the time. But the truth is that levels take very long in our game, like way over an hour for some levels. So it spreads out rather nicely. But you have to keep that in mind, of course. And if you are interested how it looks in the editor, it's basically, this is the level without triggers for dialogue, and then after we're done implementing it, it looks like this. So yeah, that's all I have on dialogue during gameplay. Let's briefly reiterate what we heard today. For the New Orleans level, we showed you how we start with early concept and blocking with Felix. Then Dorian told you about decoration and all the thought that goes into their micro-narratives. Matt showed you all the thoughts that go into designing a level, a setup in a level. And finally, I told you a bit about how we approach dialogue. So yeah, I hope you got something out of this talk, and thank you for listening.